Today's lecture is sponsored by the Malcolm Anderson Lecture Fund. The fund was established in 1987 in honor of D. Malcolm Anderson, a fourth-generation Chautauquan who served in the U.S. Department of Justice as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania, and eventually as Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. He was also a founding partner in the Pittsburgh law firm of Anderson, Moreland, and Bush. Mr. Anderson was an active Chautauquan and served as a trustee of the institution from 1982 to 1990. Please join me in thanking the Anderson family for their lasting support of Chautauqua. This week, we've revisited moments in our history and attempted to understand why, as a society, we seem prone to forgetting or repeating the mistakes and monstrosities of the past. How might we truly confront and prevent those circumstances to which we've so often said, never again? With Sarah Bloomfield, David Gran, and Beverly Warren, we've explored history and memory in the 21st century through tragedies of varying scales, seeking to understand how we might preserve, honor, and ultimately learn from them. And yesterday, Abby Smith Rumsey enlightened us to the risks, yes, but also the tremendous possibilities of the digital age and its effect on our collective memories. Today's program serves as the conclusion to both the morning lecture series and our companion 2 p.m. interfaith lecture series, which spent this week recalling the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and particularly his too often ignored later understandings about the intersection of race, war, and poverty. Joining us this morning are two individuals who worked with Dr. King directly on these issues. Our friend, the Reverend Joan Brown Campbell, is an ordained minister with standing in two Christian denominations, the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, and the American Baptist Church. She was the first woman to be Associate Executive Director of the Greater Cleveland Council of Churches, the first woman to be Executive Director of the U.S. Office of the World Council of Churches, the first ordained woman to be General Secretary of the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA, and because we want to just keep going, the first woman director of religion at Chautauqua Institution. Having served from 1999 until 2013. A devoted activist for peace and social justice, Reverend Campbell's commitment was crafted during her life-changing work with Dr. King and was deepened in the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu referred to her, and I quote, as a woman of courage and compassion. This is reflected in her work with Charter for Compassion International, where she serves as chair of the Global Compassion Council. Reverend Campbell's many honors include the 2010 Walter Cronkite Faith and Freedom Award. She's the author of Living into Hope, A Call to Spiritual Action for Such a Time as This, and Prayers from Chautauqua. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, founder and president of the Rainbow Push Coalition, is one of the foremost civil rights, religious, and political figures of our time. For nearly 50 years, he has played a pivotal role in virtually every movement for peace, civil rights, empowerment, gender equality, and economic and social justice the world over. Reverend Jackson began his activism as a student in the 1960s. In 1965, he became a full-time organizer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was soon appointed by Dr. King to direct the Operation Breadbasket program. Reverend Jackson founded Operation Push, People United to Serve Humanity, in Chicago in 1971, and the National Rainbow Coalition in Washington, D.C. in 1984. In 1996, the organizations merged to form the Rainbow Push Coalition, combining efforts in changing public policy and expanding educational, business, and employment opportunities for the disadvantaged and people of color. Reverend Jackson campaigned for the U.S. presidency in 1984 and in 1988. He's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Order of the Companions of O.R. Tambo, the highest civilian honors in the United States and South Africa, respectively. In 2010, Reverend Jackson was inducted into England's prestigious Cambridge Union Society. And because at Chautauqua we can never have too many reverends on stage, we're pleased to have our own Vice President of Religion and Senior Pastor, the Right Reverend V. Gene Robinson, here to engage our two guests in conversation and later to moderate the question and answer period. Gene, and I'm about to leave you with all of this. It's a great honor to welcome to our stage Gene Robinson, Joan Brown Campbell, and Jesse Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, let me just echo Michael's words. We are so deeply honored that you would join us this morning. But I also know that it's a bit of a sad time because we're all grieving the loss of Aretha Franklin, and I know that you were very close to her. And I wondered, before we really get started, if you would like to say a few words about her and her role, both in music and in civil rights.
Well, good morning. It's rather sad for me. I've known Aretha virtually since we were teenagers, really. And this past Wednesday, I had prayer with her twice. First walked in, she was in a deep coma, it seemed. And I said, Aretha's Jesse, and she opened her eyes momentarily, and she grasped my hand, and we prayed with the group around us. I had a chance to feel the warmth of her hands one more time and to kiss her forehead. It was difficult to let go. But I relish her memory and her legacy so much. Her father was an ordained minister, maybe the most renowned minister of our time, Reverend C.L. Franklin, known the world over, really. But the night, in 1963, the march in Detroit preceded the march on Washington, chaired by her father, Reverend Franklin. The I Have a Dream speech was in Detroit, then in Washington. Her father was a very involved minister. And one Sunday night, he used to do a sermon every Sunday night on WLAC, Nashville, Tennessee. And he said, tonight I'm going to introduce my daughter to sing, and she really can sing. And she sang a song that night, There's a Land Where We'll Never Grow Old. It was an instant hit. You could tell she had that special X factor. And so across the years, from singing Never Grow Old to Ave Maria, to the album of James Cleveland, What the Prayer May Have in Jesus, to Respect, the range of music and the range of years have meant so much to all of us. And I think lastly, I've been amazed this week, the last 2 days, how much interest there is in her beyond the music. It's like musicians cannot live by bread alone. They cannot live by, what else did she do? Well, when Dr. King was at the height of his anti-Vietnam War challenge, and they tried to cut our resources off, she did, along with Harry Belafonte, an 11-city tour, raising money for the organization. It was so hostile a tour that we got to Houston, and she went on the stage with Dr. King to present us flowers. They put tear gas in the fans. We had to evacuate the building. But she stood tall, and the next night she sang again. And when he was killed, she did Precious Lord at the funeral. So she's kind of always been there. And so her work, when I ran for president in 84, hot item in 84, she did a fundraiser. She's kind of always been there, and so she's like a sister beloved. So I said 2 days ago, the earth gave up a lot of music, and surely the heavens received it. If there's a Heavenly Choir night, it has a lead singer called Aretha Franklin. and she never sang music that would denigrate us by race or by gender. She did not go for that. Well, I must say that today, artists like Aretha, because how they're broken through, because unless you have a self-denigrating, race-denigrating, gender-denigrating music, it can't make the radio. The last 10 years, we know Aretha really more by legacy than we know about current records, but she never stopped working. And I might add, it occurs to me, with all of her civil rights, her last concert, even with pancreatic cancer, she did a concert with Elton John to help AIDS victims. Here she is with pancreatic cancer, helping those who had AIDS, and that is a signature of her work beyond music. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Jesse. Maybe I should start by saying that it is indeed a pleasure to be here today on this particular day with this particular opportunity we have. For me to be once again with Jesse, we've walked many walks together, and it has always been for me a time of growth, a time of some tears, and a best friend, as we have been with one another. And so I say thank you for the opportunity of being a part of this stage, and especially Jesse with you. We know lots of secrets about each other, and so we're perfectly safe. Having worked here, of course, for quite a number of years, there are also secrets you probably all know about me that I don't even know that you know. So it is quite a different thing for me not to be in your shoes introducing. That's a little bit easier than to be the talking one. And so as we move along in just trying to remember, I think, which is a very important thing, the role that Dr. King played in the life of all of us, of all of the things that both Jesse and I and others have walked through as we take a look now at what's before us today and what we've learned from yesterday and how we will move ahead in a country much in need of what it is that these people of the past have given to us.
Reverend Jackson, all this week we've been remembering Dr. King in this 50th anniversary year of his assassination. But sometimes I wonder if we don't over-sentimentalize or perhaps over-romanticize Dr. King. And I wonder what you could tell us about working with him that might correct that and give us a reasonable understanding of the enormous contribution he and you and others made.
Well, it is true that sometime in time we become sentimental. I think we've under-contextualized him. Next year will be the 400th year since African Americans came here enslaved. We didn't come as immigrants looking for a better way of life, did not come as refugees in desperation. We too were in cages at the border, but sold as a government policy. The slave ship was very different than the Carnival liner that brought immigrants to this country. And for 246 years, there was slavery, legal to marry, to learn to read, to write. 246. When the Declaration of Independence came in 1776, we'd been here 157 years as non-people. And when they finally got to the Constitution, 12 years later, well, they're three-fifths human. It is in the context, therefore, that we brought it all for the evil on our system. And so by 1862, Lincoln said in this horrendous war, without going through all of this, that if you don't rejoin, I'll even free them. And of course, freeing them meant switching the balance of power in the military. And when that happened, the black soldiers enabled us to save the Union and to end slavery. So watch night service in our churches. Its root is freedom fighters watching all night. December 31st, 1862, to see if he would sign the document on 1863. But then, as I'm sure no doubt Brian told you when he was here, Stevenson, this past week, segregation was more violent than slavery. In slavery, at least you had to preserve the slaves as your property, to have sex and make other little slaves, and to work for you. So slaves were assets. Free people were threats. And so between 1877 and 1950, 5,000 blacks were lynched without one conviction.
Right.
And so we came north really not so much looking for work, but as domestic refugees. And in the context, Dr. King emerges out of that context. Toward the end of it, 1954, we live in our faith, we live under the law. And the law, no matter what your talents were, the law said slavery you could not move until 1863. 1896, a radical legal setback. 1954, we underestimate the role of Thurgood Marshall and that group of lawyers who changed the law in 1954. Dr. King emerged. In response to Rosa Parks was sat down. The sign above the driver's head that read, "Color from the rear, whites from the front. Those who violate will be punished by law." And they boycotted. He emerged out of that situation. And it is true that in 55, Emmett Till was lynched. As Mrs. Parks went down, why didn't you go to the back of the bus? You could have been injured, could have been hurt. She said, well, I thought about it. I thought about Emmett Till, I couldn't go back. But she had been planning to sit in for over several months, a period of several months. So I think emerges ending legal segregation, the Public Accommodations Bill of '64. The day he gave a speech in Washington from Texas across to Florida to Maryland, we couldn't use a single public toilet. I was arrested trying to use a public library in 1906 as a student. We couldn't buy ice cream at Holiday Inn. We couldn't rent a room at Holiday Inn. We couldn't buy ice cream at Howard Johnson. Legal segregation. He broke the back of that. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so those were so perilous until he was killed in the process. He stirred up toward him enmity and hate and violence. And that season seemed to have retreated for a moment. It's back full scale now.
John?
I think I'll move just a little bit to, once you begin a subject that your heart has been attached to, you always worry that where to start. What's the story that really tells what it is that happened? And I guess for me, it was Martin Luther King and the days that he spent in Cleveland. In the time period in which there had never been in the United States an African American mayor. And Dr. King was committed to making that happen. And at that point in time, his commitment was focused on the city of Cleveland. And it was his thought that one of the ways that we might be able to move, and to move in a pretty unmovable situation, would be if local congregations would become interested in how our city could grow and how it could be moving ahead if we could think about an African American mayor. Many of you know this story, but what you don't really know in some ways is the struggle that we underwent to get to that place. And I still remember being in a meeting of people, like all church people. We had lots of meetings. And this particular group was put together to deal with and to be in community with Dr. King. And so I remember very well when Dr. Martin Luther King said in the middle of the meeting that we were having, "You know that I have been to every black church in the city of Cleveland." And these are his words, not mine. And as he said, "I think I've got it now. I think I know how the black church works. But do you know," he said, "that I've never been invited to a white church in the whole year that I've been here?" Well, I was young, eager, uninformed, believed that everything was going to go right, Jesse. And I said, "Well, I think you'd be welcome at our church." And I'm sure that our pastor, who happens to be in the congregation that was out here today, and I said, "I know that Dr. Pennybacker would be really happy to have you come to our congregation." We moved to the next step. He took heart in this and said, "That would be wonderful. I'd be happy to go there. When shall we start?" I, being young and naive, and young and naive people are okay. There's a lot they don't know. But I'd had a preacher that kept telling us that this is what was ahead of us, that this is what we had to work about. We had to put our minds and hearts and soul together to be an America that was who we know we ought to be. And so I called him on the phone. He happened to be on vacation. It was July. And I said, "Guess who's coming to our church?" He took a deep breath and said, "Be strong, be ready, and tell me when is it going to be, and please, you have all of my blessing, move ahead." What I didn't know is a longer story than we have time to tell. There were a number of people in this congregation who decided this was one of the worst ideas they had ever heard of. That no, we didn't want Martin Luther King, and no, we were not going to invite him to come into the church. But of course, they couldn't say it quite that way. And so they did very clever things like saying, "You know, we've been thinking about the fact that the church, really the main building of the church and the main, really needs to be redone." We hadn't had enough money to do that the last time I heard about it. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came the resources that they could begin taking the beginning parts of the church and the church where all the people gathered. And then, of course, they said we certainly wouldn't want to insult him by not having a proper building in which to have him. And so the story deepened. And I probably don't even have to tell you. Many of you know the story, or you can imagine the story. But the church had in it many more people who wanted him there than people who were fearful to have him there. They were the courageous ones. And they said, "Let's do this. Let's invite Dr. King to come here to our congregation. He had never been to a white congregation in Cleveland in that period of time. So time went on. A few months, not too long, the troublemakers became quite a bit more so, more noise, but the people determined to have him also increased. And so we decided, what could we do? Well, we thought, we have a backside of the church, and it looks right out on the street, and we can have Dr. King come and speak from there. My friends, the story is long, the story is painful, and the story is enormously hopeful. Dr. King came. He knew the story behind it. He knew before we told him. And when we looked out where he came into the church, took one look around, and he said, "And I will be speaking," I said, "Right outside." He knew. Right. He knew in a minute. And we looked out, and thousands of people were gathered. Far more people than could ever have been inside the church.
Fantastic.
And so from that day to this, that church has on its back steps, during the ministry of Albert M. Pennybacker, Martin Luther King came and he spoke to the church. And that church was never the same again.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you.
You know, Bishop, one of the concerns that Dr. King had was that we have been taught and learned the lesson well how to survive apart. We've not been taught how to live together, which is our challenge. Racism, after all, is unscientific. It's well taught. It's a social order. Someone has to unteach a bad lesson learned well. The question, will the church be the teacher or an extension of the bad lesson? And so we lean heavily upon the church. I was sharing earlier, I was in Mississippi some years ago about to speak for United Methodist Church on Sunday morning. And the words, Jesse Jackson going to speak at this church, you know, the bedlam broke out. And they finally said that I could speak. And when I would challenge them to love you one another as I've loved you and the like, was this sermon's theme. The politicians who were going to come, who backed away, with the next stop in the welcome line. When the church does speak, its voice matters. In the absence of its voice is a dereliction of duty. It must speak and be heard.
Thank you. That leads me to ask this next question. Joan mentioned being hopeful. So Dr. King was often heard to talk, this was not his line, but he quoted it about the arc of justice being long, but inevitably bending towards justice. And he was always able to speak a word of hope. And that saying, it tends to point to the fact that at the end of the day, justice wins. Where did Dr. King, where did you, who are also known for saying keep hope alive, where did that hope come from?
Well, this thing was the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But we must bend it. It will not bend on its own. We, the people, must bend it. And bending it creates a kind of reaction. If you draw a line here, and people on both sides of the line, and someone puts up a wall, on the other side of the wall is ignorance, fear, hatred, and violence. It's not those who are ignorant, hateful, and fearful. It's those who control the wall. They control both sides. Those who have the power to control the wall. And so it is that Dr. King's point was that to pull the walls down requires an awful lot of strength, because the wall protectors are very well funded. Because if we're not divided by race, then no telling who can be senator or CEO. We're not divided by gender, no telling who can fly the airplane, who can be the medical, so that those who control the wall control the behavior. So our point was then and is now to pull down walls and build bridges. What strikes me is that there is in many ways today enormous victories we've not stopped to calculate. There is a New South today in so many ways. You couldn't have the Carolina Panthers and Atlanta Falcons behind the Cotton Curtain wall is in. You couldn't have Michelin Tire Company and Continental Tire, #1 tire producer in America today is South Carolina. Couldn't have had behind the Cotton Curtain. You couldn't have Boeing in South Carolina and Toyota in Mississippi. And so when the walls are down, when the big ball game took place between Alabama and Georgia for the big #1 football rating in Atlanta, Georgia, Wallace on one side and Maddox on the other, Dr. King and the other in their graveyards. The fact that that game was held in Atlanta, Georgia, but you choose to use the uniform color, not skin color, direction, not complexion. That is enormous growth. There's an attempt now to turn that back. Trump can turn the clock back, but he cannot turn time back. We ain't going back. We're not going back. The irony is that those who benefited the most have been the most vulnerable to manipulation. Met a group in Kentucky. We were campaigning in 16. Reverend, we agree. We really do want affordable care. We don't want Obamacare. If you want affordable care, don't want Obamacare. You want an omelet, don't want the eggs. As if you want affordable health care but don't want Obamacare. You want an omelet but don't want the eggs. Y'all got that? Yeah. People's mind twisted. The South lost its cotton industry. Now it has technology and athletics and academics. The South is better off than it's ever been. From airports to seaports, it's better off than it's ever been in the history of our country. And so Dr. King said we must bend, and that the bend that requires a lot of attacks, including death, which he faced.
That struggle obviously continues today in some current movements, and I'm wondering if you could compare those days in the past to movements like Black Lives Matter or like William Barber's revival of the Poor People's Campaign. How are they similar and how are they different?
Black Lives Matter is a hashtag, an old movement saying that we matter. The abolitionists were saying Black Lives Matter. Anti-segregationists were saying Black Lives Matter. Those who were saying make lynching a federal crime. By the way, lynching is not yet a federal crime. Lynch is not yet a federal crime. Lynch is not yet a federal crime. We're saying Black Lives Matter. And it seems that once the 54th decision was passed, we kind of gave up that issue. Right. Now, what happened was after these spate of killings without consequences, Trayvon Martin killed in Florida, and the killer walks free. Diallo killed in New York, and the police walk free. Rodney King beaten in L.A., you see it on film, and the beaters walk free. And then Brown killed in Ferguson, Missouri, said, well, Black Lives Matter. It's really a hashtag, but it's the same matter of equal protection under the law. And we expect the leadership for that change we see to come from the church. If it doesn't come to the church, we're all doomed, really.
And why is the response, well, all lives matter? Why is that a bad response or insufficient response?
It's insufficient as much as it is wrong, I think. I mean, It's very interesting that this is how the question comes out. I think if you just take 1 minute back for a minute, one of the things that I always think we forget to talk about, because it's so well known to those of us that were working with it, is that Dr. King was really here to make sure that this country could have the first African American mayor of a major city that we have ever had. And so a lot of the sacrifices that he made when he was present, particularly in the Cleveland area, was to make it possible for that to happen. And Cleveland then did give us the first African American mayor in the country. And I think sometimes Dr. King was responsible for so many things to move forward, perhaps more than he has ever been given credit for. It was his energy and his being willing to come forward to say, we need to keep moving on this. He was not somebody, Jesse would say this more, he did not give up. He would at times say, you could hear him say, people would say, aren't you afraid? He was never afraid to say, I'm challenged, of course. But this is what we're called to do and be. It wasn't his own internal fear that was the issue. What was the issue for him was, where do we need to go as a people? And I willing to give myself for that purpose.
I also think that on this All Lives Matter, of course all lives matter, except that was not the subject.
Right.
If whites were being shot by police and the killer's walking away free, if one were dismissive of that, one would say, white lives matter, women matter. But that was not the case. The case really was blacks being killed without consequences. And that's why all lives really do matter. But when you consider the fact that the legacy of slavery, we must never forget this. 246 years, 100 years of legal Jim Crow and lynching, and then the law changed in 54. We must never forget the legacy of discrimination is real, it's institutional, and it's structural. And so to that extent, all lives really do matter. But you know, when we play on the football field together, when the Buffalo Bills play the New York Giants, why on the football field do we get along so well? Blue versus red, is your skin color, not skin color, it's uniform color, direction, not complex. Why do we get along so well? It's a violent, confrontational sport. A black guy from Buffalo want a white guy from Buffalo to tackle a black guy from New York City. A white guy from New York City want a black guy to defeat a white guy from Buffalo. What about that space and time that allows us to be the freedom to be our best persons because of some rules? Whenever the playing field is even, 10 yards for all first downs, 100 by 50 field, and the rules are public, and the goals are clear, the referees are fair, the score is transparent, we can accept the outcome.
Right.
But if the field were not even, if blacks had to run 12 yards for a first down because they came from a broken home, and whites had to run 8 yards because they inherited some yards,
Yeah.
wouldn't work. If when there was a touchdown, somebody had to go to a private room and determine if it was a touchdown or not. Something about truth and transparency that has power. And so the same is true with the case of women. Whenever the playing field is even, and the rules are public, and the goals are clear, and the referees are fair, and the score is transparent. We may win, we may lose, but we can accept the outcome because fairness matters.
Exactly right.
And I must say, on this last campaign, I don't take you too far afield, but when Kennedy beat Nixon by 112,000 votes, less than one vote per precinct, and Ted White, all the guys around Kennedy were geniuses. And then Nixon beat Humphrey by 400,000 votes, and he was the winner. Hillary beat Trump by 3 million, and she's not the winner. It ain't transparent, it ain't fair. How in a one-person, one-vote democracy you win by 3 million and lose?
So if you haven't noticed, there are a lot of white people here.
That's what I want
And
to talk about.
I'm wondering if you were to give advice on how best to be a white ally of this movement, what would that advice be?
Move from racial battleground to common ground on issues that don't box us out. For example, affordable health care transcends one side of town. It takes effort for a person with toothache to pick at a dentist. It takes effort for people without health care to fight against it, yet some people did. Equal high quality public education for all children. Schools cost less than jails. You know? Vote your hope and not your fear. The value of coalitions. Surely if the ball players have figured out, we can figure it out. But of course, the treacherous trick is when a young African-American male puts children in the classroom, the president puts them in cages, and the church is silent where the cages are. That breaks the rhythm of transparency and fairness. LeBron put children in a classroom. Trump put them in cages. The silence of the church is betrayal.
I think I want to look out at this crowd, the Chautauqua that I know so well, and I know what I would like to really put forward today is to say, you look around this room. My friends, we have power. We can make a difference. It is not just a matter of what could be done, what should be done, who else can do it. The fact of the matter is, as I look out across all of this space, I know that within these rooms and these people sitting here, there is the possibility, maybe even the probability, that what brings us here to this place that calls us to be our best selves, that perhaps today we can take one another's hands and say, our best selves call us today to something that will guide us into a nation that is more fair, that is more clear about who we are and where we want to be. We can make a difference.
You know, Joan, what strikes me is that the most challenging rule, how can we help us, is the golden rule.
Do unto others.
Treat others as you would like to be treated.
Yourself.
It seems simplistic, and yet there it is. Treat others, people who work should get paid for working. Half of Americans make less than $15 an hour. 55% of blacks make less than $15 an hour. They're working, but they cannot afford tuition. Student loan debt is greater than credit card debt. They're working, but they cannot afford a house note or take a vacation. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Pay your workers.
That's right.
The difference between us is not scientific, it's social. There's nothing. Science does not separate us, socialization separates us. We must undermine that perverse socialization process. It makes us look at each other kind of funny.
Permit me to ask this last question. It's a selfish question on my part. Dr. King wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail, which we all know. If you were writing a letter today to the church, the mosque, the synagogue, to people of faith, what kind of action would you call them to?
First of all, he wrote a letter to the church. He didn't just write a letter. The religious leaders who had accepted, they had adjusted to segregation by race in the workplace, in schools, in public facilities, in voting. They had adjusted to second-class citizenship for people of color. And Dr. King said, we can't adjust, we must not resist, we must resist. They became tolerant of injustice. And so he said, I'm not the problem. I represent the solution, learning how to live together. You know, that seed was planted in 1963. We saw it germinate last year when blacks and whites voted their interests in Alabama and won. They won the Senate third election. Sometimes you plant seeds, you can't plant a seed today and say grow.
Right.
Seeds have to germinate. Some hit the rock, some in the wind, and some germinate. And so what people in Alabama learning to live together. I was anxious to see with Tuscaloosa and University of Auburn what those counties would do. In Tuscaloosa, where you have Mercedes-Benz, and in Lee County, Auburn, where you have Honda. People learn to, and when Auburn plays Alabama in the big football game, they become more socialized. You could not organize a don't let blacks play football at the University of Alabama movement and survive. You cannot organize a Mercedes-Benz get out of here because you're from Germany. They're learning to live. So learning to live together, that takes them. I've gone to many schools where they say a black is in the school, and will he survive? Well, should not that there be a course on whites learning how not to be racist? Why should I be taught to survive among racism? Are you being taught not to be racist in the first place?
Right.
You know, there's a fight in many schools. Can we get black history taught in the schools? Well, can we get white history taught in the schools? Really white history taught in the schools. I mean, 246 years of being when we were finally free without education, the right to marry, the right to own land. White history is basically subsidized history. 346 years of work without wages is quite a subsidy. You get it? Okay.
Great. Reverend Jackson is willing to take a few questions, but as I walk over to the podium, would you join me in thanking Reverend Jackson for being here? And for Joan Brown Campbell, my predecessor.
If we can do it, they can do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. While we are waiting for questions to come forward, may I ask you just this question? It's often been said that in the last 2 or 3 years of Dr. King's life, that he became quite a lot more dangerous because he put together racism with poverty and with militarism, especially as it was getting lived out in the Vietnam War. How did you see his message change over time, or do you think it did? And when he began to do that intersectional work long before it was a fad, was he more dangerous?
In Montgomery, the issue was the single issue of barbarism, denial of access to public accommodations. We fought the right to vote. The issue was how to begin to learn to vote and share power and stop lynching people because they vote. After all, when Emmett Till was lynched, one of about 700 in that state, someone asked a juror, since the killer was virtually bragging about he did the kill, why didn't you convict the killer? So I cannot imagine the jury was out 30 minutes, wouldn't stop getting soft drink, it's been quicker than that. I cannot imagine a white going to jail for killing a Negro and use a more pejorative term than that. Well, he was fighting that. He looked in his last stat, he said, well, we have 2 last stats. He said, one, we have public accommodations, we have the right to vote. People living in trailer camps. Most poor people are not black, they're white, they're female, they're young. They live in Appalachia, they live in the Smoky Mountains. So we had a staff meeting in Atlanta, and there were some whites from Appalachia, some blacks from Deep South, some Native Americans, some Jewish allies from New York, led by Al Lowenstein, some peace activists, and some labor leaders. How to march to Washington and go to jail even to have a job or an income for everybody. Relieve people of the fear of somebody taking their job. We should be free of somebody going to take my job, take my education. There should be enough of it for all of us to share. And he said, now where is the money? Well, the money that was for the war on poverty is going to war in Vietnam. The healing budget is giving into the killing budgets. We must end the war and shift the budget and fight for jobs and income for everybody. That's how I got interacted on that basis.
Thank you. In terms of advancing the civil rights movement, what do you think Martin Luther King might have thought of the presidency of Barack Obama?
Oh, whoa, what a question.
He would have been very impressed with the evolution of our struggle that made it possible. Barack ran the ball over the end zone line, but 50 years of work made that possible. That is to say that from the balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was killed, to the balcony at the White House, was 40 years in the wilderness. In that 40-year period, 68 to 08, black and white women began to function more together in terms of coalitions. We had the period of the Rainbow Coalition. We had the 84, 88 campaigns. When I ran in 84, for example, I put on 2 million new votes and got about 400 delegates. Something was wrong. Well, what was wrong was if you got 48% of the vote and somebody else got 49, they got all 100. Called winner take all. So what we did was say, no, the rule must be proportionality. You get your proportional votes. Well, we democratized democracy. So, Bishop, what happened was in 88 when I ran, we got 1,200 delegates because we got our share of delegates and votes. Based on the 84 rules, Hillary would have won in 08 because she won at the end California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas. On the 88 rules would be proportionality. Barack won because he would have been pleased with the adjustment in the rules to make it fun. He also would have been impressed with Barack's presidency. Barack did several things. One, he brought honor to the White House. His wife, his mother, raising those 2 girls in the house is remind me of Moses' mother raising him in the big house, you know. The academic, the issues that Michelle took on, not just sewing, but things like exercise and health care for children and the care for veterans' spouses. 26 million Americans have health care who never had it before. It's a big deal. Took the risk and made a loan and bailed out the automotive industry. We're number one, we were sinking. That risk paid off. The climate change deal in Paris, the reality of scientific climate change. Unemployment went from 9% down to 4%, down to 6%. He inherited a depression, a bank collapse. Trump inherited a trajectory. And so Dr. King would have been pleased with and also he did it against a headwind. Republicans had one issue, defeat him. In spite of that, I think he came out 8 years later with honor and some progress.
You better sit down.
This question from the audience. Why is Sunday the most segregated day in America?
Because y'all don't want to go to church with us. No.
It would be more fun the other way.
I really think that our religion we put culture over Christ. And it is the culture of the Sunday morning service and locking people in and locking people out. The church tried to coexist with slavery. It tried to coexist with legal segregation. It tried to coexist with unjust law. The church cannot coexist with evil and be good. And but some efforts, for example, some of the black schools in the South were built by white churches. They tried to at least skim off the fact, just because but you may have an all-white congregation, you still can do some good. You might adopt some children. You might support some black schools in the South, which is what the abolitionists did after slavery. In Morehouse and Spring, those schools still exist today because all white congregations did the right thing.
You used a number of very dramatic and effective examples of football. One of our people in the audience wonders what you think about black players taking a knee during the Star-Spangled Banner.
If one were to burn the flag, a flag contiguous with the American flag, that's desecration to the Confederate flag. A bow and knee is to honor the flag. It's saying to the flag, honor your promise. So if one raises the American flag, one raises the cross, and one knee to the flag, in contrast to those who burn the cross and raise up the Confederate flag, that's the opposite. So again, Trump has turned truth on its head. What happens if you are a soldier in Afghanistan today, where you are likely to shoot or get shot, and you hear that the President's White House cannot deny he has used the N-word? As a soldier, do you salute such a commander-in-chief? Do you take one knee before the flag? I'd rather take one knee before the flag and say, this land's my land. You have the constitutional right to burn the flag. You have the moral obligation to honor it. When you take one knee, you honor the flag. And so if those players want their dignity, they must not bow to Trump's misdefinition of their intent.
And let me put our last question first to you, Joan, and then to Reverend Jackson. It says here, humanity has a tendency to shun the unfamiliar. Do you think multiculturalism prevents us from developing a familial, common American culture?
You want to take it?
You want to take a crack at that, Joan?
Thank you very much for giving me the easy question.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Give me the last sentence of
Sure.
it again.
Do you think multiculturalism actually prevents us from developing a familial, common American culture? Is that the goal we're shooting for? Is a familial, common American culture? Or is it something else?
I love you for picking the most complex question but let me say that I think multiculturalism is a moving forward. It's a gift. It's not something that keeps us from moving. I think it is the very thing that makes us move. I mean, I could walk up and down these aisles and we could have a conversation about this place, this Chautauqua right now, and the Chautauqua I came to when there'd never been a woman to take the job that I had. And we have watched Chautauqua change dramatically, importantly, in ways that say to the world, we are here because we are all God's children, even those who wouldn't perhaps frame it in that language. But the fact of the matter is, the best thing we can do is to also take a look at ourselves and say, we've made changes. Not as fast as maybe we should have, not as deep as maybe we should have. We're most assuredly not done with the changes that need to be made in this very place's life or in our own lives. But in my own life, it was always the changes. And to some degree, the ones you were most fearful of, the ones that you had the least insurance as to how it was all going to come out.
Let me,
Jesse, let me say just one thing.
Yes, ma'am.
I love it.
He's a wise man.
All you have to do is have children. And then you begin to see the wisdom, the beauty, what it is that they can give to you in the middle of the most frustrating of days. But the fact is that we can learn from one another to be the open people, the welcoming people that we're intended to be. Amen.
Let me see how we can kind of follow up on relating to what we're trying to do, because this fall there are 4 million blacks in the South unregistered, and 2.5 million registered who didn't vote the last time. If they vote in coalition, we can take the South back and save our country.
Amen.
And so,
That's right.
so you who want to join that movement, and it's a multiracial rainbow effort, because part of the reaction about the Latinos coming in the South, you get 20, 30%. The 100 major cities are now majority black and brown. Black, brown, plus labor, plus women equals a new majority already in the country. That's part of what the pushback is all about. And so, if you contact us at www.rainbowpush.org, or Facebook, Reverend Jesse L. Jackson, Instagram at Reverend J. Jackson, Twitter at Reverend J. Jackson. Donations, contributions, support. Text push to 41444. Text push to 414. Now, why did I say that? Well, I want the money.
Let me have that.
No, my point is that question has some, Bishop, has some racial assumption. For example, the way Jesus handled that was, rather than deal with the black-white, he said, we're bound by values. Our color is not the issue. What bounds us are values. So that you take black and white notes on the piano to make the music, you know. You can't have all white, all black notes on the piano and make music. He said, you know, a man was tending to his business one day walking down the street, assuming he was a Jewish guy. And some thieves jumped from behind the bush and robbed him. Assumption was they were Jewish guys as well. They were his own people. And while laying there dying, he looked up and saw in the distant relief coming, a rabbi, a minister, man of God, went to the other side of the street and kept walking. Another man of his own ethnic, the Levite, went across and kept walking. The Samaritan, different country, different culture, worship God differently, helped him up to get relief. Who is my neighbor? Different religions, worship, but bound by common values. Inasmuch you've done it to the least of these,
My brother.
done it to me. Common values. I was hungry, you fed me. Naked, you clothed me. In prison, you visited me. Common values. We need not be of one color to have common values. I would argue we must move from racial battleground to economic common ground to moral higher ground. If we make that transition, then we'll make decisions this fall, not based upon race, based upon reason. Do we want children in cages or not? Do we want to feed the hungry or not? Educate children or not? Affordable health care or not? Living security or fear or not? We must be bound by common values. The race, most people in the world, I was in South Korea 2 weeks ago, most folk in the world, half of all human beings are Asian. Half of them are Chinese. 1/8 African, 1/4 Nigerian, 2/3 of our neighbors speak Spanish in this hemisphere. English is a minority language in our hemisphere. Most folks in the world are yellow, brown, black, non-Christian, poor, female, young, and don't speak English. Let's be bound by values, not torn apart by skin complexion.
Please join me in thanking Joan Brown Campbell and Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Thank you. He's going to go out here. Thank you, thank you. You're welcome, you're welcome. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.